Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. It's Monday night. We have news on the war in Ukraine. It has entered Russia. Ukraine is striking deep inside Russian territory and threatening more strikes. Russia, in turn, is talking about the nuclear option. It may be bluster, but it's still dangerous. You see, in a war, nothing can and should be taken for granted. Meanwhile, the West is preparing for a meeting hosted by Saudi Arabia, attended by India and others, an attempt to broker peace in Ukraine. Only problem, they've not invited Russia. So what's this meeting all about? We'll tell you. In Pakistan, a suicide blast at a political rally has left scores of people dead and many more injured, and the election season hasn't even properly kicked off. We'll bring you a full report. In West Africa's Niger, a new battleground between Vladimir Putin and the West is emerging. In China, a typhoon has left a trail of destruction and devastation in Beijing. In Italy, they cannot decide how to exit China's Belt and Road. In Japan, there's a debate over Oppenheimer. And in America, cricket is looking for a new market. Don't miss the story. The headlines first. No end to Quran burning in Sweden. Pages of the holy book set to fire outside Sweden's parliament. Police had given permission for this protest. Sweden's ties with Muslim nations nosedive over repeated desecration of the Quran. In India, the Supreme Court called sexual violence against women in Manipur horrendous. It says women being assaulted in other parts of the country cannot be used as justification. The hearing comes after a video of a mob parading two naked women sparked nationwide outrage. The court also pulled up the Manipur police over this. In the first, Air Forces of China and the United Arab Emirates will train together. The Falcon Shield 2023 exercises will take place in China in the month of August. This is the latest push by Beijing to forge closer ties with West Asia. Crisis at Lebanon's central bank chief ends his term, but there is no successor in sight. Riyad Salameh, who handed over his post, is wanted in several European countries. He's accused of financial crimes. He was Lebanon's central bank chief for 30 years. And a Japanese court sentences a man to 23 years in jail for the 2021 Halloween attack. He was found guilty of attempted murder and arson on a Tokyo train while dressed as Joker. The 26-year-old said he was suicidal after his fiancée broke up with him. It's day 523 of the Russian invasion. If you're Vladimir Putin, that's around 500 days too many. It was supposed to be a special military operation, short, incisive, and overwhelming. Instead, it's become a battle of attrition, long, grinding, and costly. When the war started, Ukraine was cautious and calculated. They picked their battles. They tried not to poke the Russian bear too much. But that's not the case anymore. Ukraine is taking the war into Russia. They're striking deep inside Russian territory, and they're not denying it anymore. In fact, they're claiming responsibility for this escalation. The latest was seen on Sunday. Ukraine deployed 3 drones to strike Moscow. One of the drones was shot down. The other 2 were disengaged by electronic warfare. But the drones did crash into an office building in the Russian capital. Take a look at this. On paper, the damage is not very much. One person is injured, some structural damage to the building, that's about it. But the psychological impact is huge. You see, Russians have largely been isolated from the war in Ukraine. They cannot eat McDonald's anymore, but their safety and security was never in question. Ukraine wants to change that. This was the 4th attempt to strike Moscow in 1 month. None of them was a military success. But maybe the goal is not military after all. Maybe the goal is to make Russian citizens feel vulnerable. If the people feel unsafe, they will put pressure on the government, even in Russia. And if the government is under pressure, maybe they will end the war. That is the assumption. In the past, Ukraine has distanced itself from such attacks. They would neither confirm nor deny their role. But this time, Zelensky chose a different path. Hours after the drone attack, he delivered one of his selfie statements. He said the war is coming to Russia.
Ukraine is getting stronger. Gradually, the war is returning to the territory of Russia, to its symbolic centers and military bases. And this is an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process.
It's a bold claim, also a dangerous one. If you strike inside Russian territory, you're inviting an escalation. You're giving Moscow an excuse to hit hard. The question is, what form will it take? Even nuclear weapons could be on the table. We are not the ones saying this, Russia is. Former President Dmitry Medvedev has sounded a warning. He is a close ally of Vladimir Putin. He is also the deputy chairperson of the Security Council in Russia. Just listen to his warning. This is what he said. Just imagine that the NATO-supported offensive turned out successful and they took away a part of our land. Then we would have to use the nuclear weapon. It's a straightforward warning. If Ukraine's counter-offensive succeeds, if Kiev manages to take Russian land, then Moscow could use nuclear weapons. That's what he's saying. Is this a serious threat or is it just bluster? I would say it's a mix of both. Talk of a nuclear attack will discourage Ukraine from attacking Russian land. Serious or not, it will scare Zelensky. As for the counter-offensive, things are still slow. Most of the fighting is happening in the northeast. Earlier today, 2 Russian missiles hit Zelensky's hometown. Around 2 people were killed. There was shelling in the city of Donetsk as well. It is held by Russian forces, this city, and they have blamed Ukraine for the latest assault. Looks like we are entering a new phase of this war. Ukraine is plotting attacks inside Russia. Meanwhile, Putin is mobilizing more resources. He has increased the maximum age for conscription. Until now, men up to the age of 27 had to do compulsory military service in Russia. Now it's up to 30 years. So more manpower will be available to the Russian military. Putin has also commissioned more warships. He was in St. Petersburg on Sunday for Russia's Navy Day. He reviewed a parade of warships and submarines. Afterwards, he said the Navy would get 30 new ships in 2023, 30 new ships this year. And this is very important. The West claims Russia's military-industrial base is failing. And if that is the case, how can they produce 30 ships in 1 year? One side is clearly lying. The question is which one? Things are clearly not going to plan for Russia. There is no denying that. But Putin has not been reduced to an international pariah. He's not a Kim Jong-un yet. This weekend, he hosted African leaders for a summit. Around 20 of them turned up in St. Petersburg. The turnout was less than the last summit. But it's not pariah levels. Putin repeated his usual claims during the summit. He blamed the West for waging a hybrid war on Russia.
We believe the problem did not arise yesterday. It was provoked by certain forces in the West who for years have been preparing a hybrid war with our country, doing everything to turn Ukraine into a tool to undermine the basis of Russia's security, to damage Russia's position in the world, and to undermine our statehood.
So what happens next? Zelensky's comments betray his intentions. He wants to take the war to Russia, to strike deep inside Russian territory. We can debate why he wants to do that. Maybe it's to increase the public pressure on Putin, or maybe he senses that Russia is weak now. But an even more important question is this: does NATO support his intentions? The United States has publicly opposed attacks inside Russian territory. They say stick to defense. Don't poke the Russians unnecessarily. And to some extent, Ukraine respected that. They never claimed responsibility for the attacks on Moscow or the sabotage incidents near the border. So what has changed now? Has Washington allowed Ukraine to take the war to Russia, or is Zelensky going rogue? There was clearly a stalemate developing towards the end of last month. Neither side was making any progress. Such statements often break for 2 reasons. Such stalemates, rather, break for 2 reasons: for escalation or for peace talks. So either one of these things is happening. We're seeing the makings of an escalation from both sides. But there are peace talks too. What's more, it's coming from an unlikely place. And that's what we'll talk about in our next story. Russia and Ukraine still want to bomb each other, but the West seems to have different ideas. As they keep pumping weapons into Ukraine, they're also exploring peace talks. A meeting is scheduled this week. Saudi Arabia is hosting it, and India has been invited to attend. The dates are August 5th and 6th. The venue is in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And among the invitees are 30-odd countries. They're all expected to send senior officials to attend. Now, we don't have a full guest list, but reports say India and Brazil are invited, so is Ukraine, countries in Europe, also Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, Chile and Zambia. They've all been asked to join. Some have confirmed their attendance, like the UK, South Africa, Poland and the European Union. An official from India is also expected to be present, but Russia has been excluded. That's right, Russia has not got an invite, so they will not have a representative in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, which raises the obvious question. Why have this meeting at all? Can there be peace or a peace deal without Russia? And what is Saudi Arabia's role here? Let's try answering these questions one by one, starting with the purpose of this meeting. This is not a peace summit. They're not calling it that. It's more like an effort to convince the global South to influence the countries which have not picked a side, countries like India. Ukraine and the West want to win them over, and that's the reason this meeting has been called. Also, this is not the first such meeting. In the month of June, some officials met in Copenhagen, and that was the first round. Although it was a much smaller group, among the attendees were Ukraine, the European Union, Brazil, India, Turkey and South Africa. And of course, the United States of America. It was represented by Jake Sullivan. He is the US National Security Advisor. He did not attend in person though. He joined the meeting on call. And this, we are told, was a preliminary conversation. It's not clear what was discussed, but it is believed that the conversation in Copenhagen led to the meeting in Jeddah. So this is the second round. And what will happen in Jeddah? The West is making an effort to find common ground, to get everyone to agree on some principles, like territorial sovereignty, like political independence, to condemn acts of aggression and the use of force. And what is the outcome that they expect from these talks in Saudi Arabia? What's the best case scenario? Perhaps a statement that is based on a widely accepted document, something like the United Nations Charter, that has a set of universally accepted principles which everyone can agree on. And what purpose will this serve? The idea is to tip the balance in Ukraine's favor, to get the global South to agree to a common platform. So when the time comes to discuss a truce with Russia, they can extract the most favorable terms. In other words, these are all preparatory meetings to get the global South on Ukraine's side. That's what the West wants. But it's easier said than done. The global South frowns upon Western sanctions. It refuses to give up its strategic autonomy just to fulfill Ukraine's wishes. You see, Kiev has pushed a rather ambitious peace plan. Ukraine wants the return of all occupied territories, and it wants all Russian troops to leave their country before any peace talks can even begin. The same plan was discussed in Copenhagen. Reports say the developing world refused to support it. Now, we don't know who specifically opposed the plan, but the attendees were the likes of India, Brazil and South Africa, like we told you. So it has to be one or more of them. Apparently, there was just one area of flexibility, the idea of shared principles. That's what they all agreed on, and that's what led to the talks in Jeddah. But why Jeddah of all places? Because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is eyeing a bigger role in world affairs. It wants to play peacemaker in Ukraine, and it has already delivered on some fronts, like facilitating a prisoner exchange and hosting Zelensky for an Arab summit in the month of May this year. That's when Riyadh said it wanted to hear from all sides. Listen to this.
Our invitation to Ukrainian President Zelensky came to hear from all sides. Since the start of the conflict, Arab countries took a decision to be positively objective. We were engaged in starting a dialogue between both sides in the hope of reaching a solution stemming from dialogue. All Arab countries are convinced that this conflict will be resolved through dialogue.
So they wanted a dialogue. Now they have a chance to host it. Saudi Arabia ticks a lot of boxes for the West. It is close to both Russia and China. It can be a mediator and influencer, and the West is betting on this. As the war drags on, it is hoping that support from the global South will tilt the balance in Ukraine's favor. We say it's an optimistic mission. Now to Pakistan, it's making news for a suicide blast. More than 45 people have been killed, 200 others have been injured. It happened at a political rally. The organizers are a party called JUIF, the Jamaat Ulema-e-Islam Fazl. They're allies of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's party. They conducted a rally in the Bajaur district in northwest Pakistan. The Islamic State has now claimed responsibility for this attack. And this isn't the first time that they've targeted this party. Pakistanis now fear more such attacks. It is election season in the country, and that usually means more violence and volatility. Our next report tells you more.
It was just another day for Pakistan. The country is heading to polls soon, and political parties are gearing up. In the country's northwest, the Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam Fazl was holding a meeting. Hundreds turned up for this. It was a way for the Islamist JUIF to rally its support, especially ahead of the elections later this year. So it was business as usual. Officials were announcing the arrival of Abdul Rashid, a leader of the Jamiat Ulema-Islam party. That's when this happened.
Today, during a Jamiat Ulema-Islam rally, there was a blast. Many of our colleagues have been martyred, many injured. Personally, I am safe, but my colleagues have suffered heavy losses.
The scenes were straight out of a doomsday. The attack was carried out by a suicide bomber. He was present at the rally and, in fact, was close to the stage where several senior party leaders were sitting. That's when he detonated his explosive vest. Soon there was dust and smoke all around. People were knocked to the ground. Several lay there soaked in their own blood. Police rushed to rescue the injured.
I am a shopkeeper, and I was also present at the rally with my son who got injured. We lost our loved ones, so many martyred in the incident. I demand that the government investigate this, because this was a brutal act. Now we don't know what will happen in the future.
This attack targeted the Jamiat Ulema-Islam Fazl. It's led by the Islamic cleric Maulana Fazlur Rahman. The JUIF is an ally of the coalition government in Pakistan. The event was to mobilize supporters ahead of the polls, but it turned into one of Pakistan's worst attacks in a decade. The party's local chief was among the dead. Two of its main leaders were also on stage, but they escaped unharmed. JUIF says this attack was an attempt to remove it from the field, but warned that such tactics wouldn't work. The bombing has drawn nationwide condemnation. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif slammed the attack. He also spoke to the JUIF Supremo over the phone, promising strict punishment for those behind the attack. Fazlur Rahman, meanwhile, called for a high-level inquiry. The location of the attack was Pakistan's Bajaur district, once a stronghold of the Tehreek-e-Taliban. But even they have distanced themselves from the attack. The TTP said such crimes cannot be justified in any way. Also, the JUIF Supremo, Maulana Fazlur Rahman, is a pro-Taliban cleric. So who exactly was behind the attack? It was the Islamic State. They have often accused the JUIF of hypocrisy. They slammed them for being an Islamic political party that supports secular governments. Last year, it was behind attacks on the party. So this could be the work of the ISIS-K. But no group has yet claimed responsibility, so nothing is certain for now. Violence during election season is not abnormal for Pakistan, but this attack couldn't have come at a worse time. The country is hosting the Chinese Vice Premier, He Lifeng. He is in Islamabad right now. Lifeng is in Pakistan to mark a decade of the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a sprawling package under which Beijing invested billions of dollars in Pakistan. But this suicide blast now seems to have cast a shadow over that.
All that that talk about bombs and explosions. Now let's talk about the bomb, the nuclear one. It's been used just twice in history. During the Second World War against Imperial Japan, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed by the United States. More than 200,000 people died instantly. 200,000. Why am I talking about this today? Because the man who made this bomb is now a celebrity. He's got his own movie, Oppenheimer. It's running in theatres across the world, but one country is strangely absent from that list, and that country is Japan. The movie still has not released in Japan. In fact, no date has been set for the release. Now, Japan does have a history of delayed releases. They don't screen every Hollywood movie. First, they see what the response is like. If it's good, then distributors jump on. But this time, there is something more at play. The story of Oppenheimer is the story of America's nuclear program. It's all about the man, his scientific struggles, his moral dilemmas, and his subsequent persecution. Do you know what's missing? His victims. Oppenheimer's invention killed 200,000 people. Their story finds no mention in the movie. Now, I get that the film is about Oppenheimer, not about Japan. The director gets to decide the story, what goes in, what doesn't. But surely, the death of 200,000 people is not something you can ignore. What do people in Japan make of this? Well, they're split over what needs to be done. One section thinks the movie will be traumatic. Others feel it's a new perspective. Listen to this.
In the end, there are still victims of the atomic bombing and bereaved families around. So I think it's possible for the film not to be shown out of consideration for those people's feelings.
I think that among others, there will be plenty of people who won't want to see it. I think there are a lot of people, like the bereaved families, who would be critical and wouldn't agree with showing it.
I think people are still interested in the film, maybe interested in the American perspective of all of this. I think maybe it might be even better to show it here and then kind of educate Japanese people even more about it.
Oppenheimer's story is a bit complicated. People say he was opposed to using the nuclear bomb, that he did not support the attack on Japan. It's a bit rich, I would say. The Manhattan Project was led by the US military. Why did Oppenheimer think they wanted the bomb? For some nice fireworks? Or to shove it in some showcase? Maybe he did feel remorse and guilt for what he did, but that does not make him innocent. Just ask the people of Japan. For them, Oppenheimer is not the story of a scientific breakthrough. It is the story of death and destruction. Maybe that's why the movie has not been released yet. Also, the timing is problematic. Hiroshima was bombed on the 6th of August. Nagasaki on the 9th of August. That's next week. So releasing Oppenheimer now would be a tone-deaf move. But this story goes beyond just one movie. It's also about storytelling. You see, it's okay to trigger conversations. Movies and art should. But it's not okay to trigger trauma. Let me tell you about another movie. This one is a Bollywood film. It's called Bawal. The movie compares a marriage to Nazi Germany. If you think that is problematic, you should hear some of the dialogues. They will make you flinch. Dialogues like, every relationship goes through its Auschwitz. Or there is a Hitler inside all of us. Now let's be clear here. This is not creative liberty. This is downright triggering and insulting. Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp in Nazi Germany. 1.5 million people died there. You can't compare it to a struggling marriage. Even the Israeli embassy in India has criticized it. They said that the movie has trivialized the Holocaust. The dialogues have comparisons have been called disturbing. It's hard to argue with that. You see, both these stories are worth telling, the Holocaust and the atomic bombings. Very important events in history. But it's also important to tell it in the right manner. The atom bomb was not just a white scientist's obsession. It was also the cause of misery in Japan. You can't separate the two things. Same with the Bollywood film. The Holocaust is not just something you read in books. It is a painful and traumatic memory for millions of Jews. And you have to respect that. You must understand the sentiment behind the story. If not, these mistakes will keep happening. And over a period of time, it becomes a new reality. How many people in the US question their government for bombing Japan? When Oppenheimer tested his bomb, Nazi Germany had already surrendered. Japan would have done the same. So why kill 200,000 people? Not a single US president has apologized for what happened. Even Joe Biden was asked before his trip to Japan this year. He said no. Movies like Oppenheimer have successfully peddled the American propaganda. They glorify bomb makers and generals. But their victims are largely forgotten. If they are remembered, it is only as collateral damage. Now let's talk about China. Xi Jinping's pet project, the Belt and Road Initiative, has suffered a setback. Italy is a member of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and now Italy wants to leave. The decision is not official yet, but the writing is on the wall. The Italian defense minister has spoken his mind. His name is Guido Crosetto. He was discussing the BRI agreement. He said Italy's decision to join the BRI was quote-unquote improvised and atrocious. Now they want to leave, but they're not sure how to leave. Listen to what the minister said, and I'm quoting, "The issue today is how to walk back from the BRI without damaging relations with Beijing, because it is true that China is a competitor, but it is also a partner." Then Italy's Prime Minister spoke about this, Giorgia Meloni. She gave an interview on Sunday. She was asked if Italy would stay or leave. Meloni said they haven't made a decision yet, but they will by December. And which way is she leaning? It seems Giorgia Meloni wants to exit with minimal damage. She wants to leave the Belt and Road, but also maintain a trade relationship with China. Listen to her statement, and I'm quoting again. "You can have good relations with China without the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's something, in my opinion, has to be discussed with Chinese government and well inside of the Italian parliament. But anyway, we will take a decision before December." This is what the Prime Minister said. Now, Italy, we know, is in an awkward situation. The odd one out in BRI. The only G7 member in this Chinese project. G7 is a group of 7 largely Western economies that were once the world's richest. Italy is a member of this club, the G7. And it signed up for the BRI. This happened in the year 2019, and it was a big coup for Beijing. In fact, Xi Jinping went to Rome himself for this. He took a victory lap when Italy agreed to sign this deal. The Chinese president said, "This partnership will benefit both parties."
We agreed that we need to strengthen synergies between the two parties and our respected development strategies to enhance collaboration in the infrastructure, ports, logistics, and shipping sectors. The goal is to build concrete and quality projects along the Silk Way.
Italy was reeling from a debt crisis, so the collaboration with Beijing made sense in 2019. But it hasn't been a win-win like Xi Jinping promised them. Trade between the two countries remains lopsided. It is tilted heavily in Beijing's favor. In May 2023, China's exports to Italy were worth over $4 billion. But Rome sent back less than $3 billion worth of goods. Now, there is a brake on investments too. Italy signed up for the BRI under the leadership of Giuseppe Conte. Conte allowed a series of large investments, but his successor, Mario Draghi, was wary. He blocked several Chinese acquisitions in Italy. And where does the current leader, Giorgia Meloni, stand? Well, she's a hardliner. She wants closer economic integration with the West. This month, she visited Washington and she vowed to improve trade ties with the US.
The United States is our most important trade partner outside the European Union. And I do agree with you, Joe, that our trade partnership is very high, but no reason why we could not improve it.
But she cannot improve ties with the US until she quits the BRI. So what's the roadblock? The major problem is negotiating this exit. Italy fears a retaliation from China. A former Italian diplomat has spoken about this. His name is Stefano Stefanini. He was Italy's ambassador to NATO. And he described Rome's dilemma in these words. Given the state of relations between the US and China, we cannot remain an ally of the US and at the same time remain in the BRI. We have to try to negotiate a peaceful or the least damaging possible exit with the Chinese. And this is what the Italian leader, Meloni, has to navigate a clear path for Italy's exit from the Belt and Road Initiative, and she needs time till December for this, she says. Here is what might help her. China's falling investments. Beijing is pouring less money into the BRI now, and I have some numbers. In 2020, China invested more than $60 billion in the BRI. The next year, in 2021, the funding fell to a little over $56 billion. There was a surge of bad loans. In the last 3 years, investments worth $78 billion have been affected. And these were loans that turned sour for Beijing. Either the debt was renegotiated or it had to be written off. So Giorgia Meloni could always argue that the BRI is no longer an attractive proposition for her country. But she is banking on the West to step up to offer the kind of money that China brings to the table. Can the US and Europe match up? And is that a game that they want to play? We should have our answers by December. Doxuri is a Korean word. It means eagle, the majestic bird. But now its meaning seems to have changed, at least for China. For many in China, Doxuri has become synonymous with destruction because this name is shared by a typhoon, one of the strongest ones to make landfall in China. It hurtled into the country last week. Now, the remnants of Doxuri are passing through Beijing and leaving destruction in their wake. Roads have turned into rivers. Torrential rainfall has broken records in the capital. At least 2 people have died, hundreds are trapped, tens of thousands have evacuated their homes. Is respite in sight? Our next report tells you.
These horrific visuals come from Beijing, where a road crumbled into the river below. Record rainfall is ravaging the Chinese capital due to Typhoon Doxuri. It has caused severe flooding that has engulfed Beijing. 2 people have been reported dead. More than 31,000 people have been evacuated from their homes in the city. Railway lines have suffered serious damage. Thousands of passengers were evacuated from trains. Work has halted on over 4,000 construction sites. Cars are being swept away by gushing waters, sometimes with people sitting inside them. One such case was seen in Beijing over the weekend, where a man was trapped in his car while it was pinwheeling down a flooded river. The man was desperately trying to crawl out. Eventually, he was saved by firefighters. But Beijing isn't the only affected area in China. Doxuri made landfall in the country on Friday and quickly became one of the strongest typhoons to ever hit the country. Areas like Hebei, Tianjin and Shaanxi are severely affected. The destruction is widespread. Doxuri downed power lines, uprooted trees.
We pruned and strengthened those trees before Doxuri arrived, but the typhoon was so forceful and those big trees still fell down. The traffic has already been restored.
Doxuri affected about 900,000 people in coastal areas.
There are 880,000 people impacted by floods in the Fujian province. Around 35,014 people are currently in the evacuation centers. According to our initial calculations, the economic loss is around 478 million, but it is still being finalized.
About half of those impacted have now resettled elsewhere. Others are wading through thigh-high floodwaters. Some of the worst affected are the elderly. The security cam footage comes from Shandong, where a bus driver battles the raging waters and tries to pull an elderly man out of the floods. Several passers-by immediately join in rescuing the man, and while he was saved, several are still trapped.
The ground floor of most apartment buildings was already submerged, while in some apartment buildings, the flood has reached the first floor.
We encountered mudslides and landslides when we were on the way to the disaster area, and we had to clear the area with the other rescuers to create a safe path.
Now, Doxuri is tapering off after causing monumental damage to China, worth over $66 million in economic losses. So, is there relief on the horizon? Not really. Heavy downpours are expected to continue in the country. There are increased concerns of floods and landslides. Rainfall is expected to ease midweek, but even so, China is already preparing for its next typhoon, the sixth one this year, called Kanun. It is already gathering strength. Storm tides are expected to hit coastal areas this week, and landfall is projected later this year. China is clearly reeling from extreme weather this year. First, it braved a summer where heat waves scorched the country. Now it's drowning in water, and caught in between are its citizens who are just trying to stay afloat.
And now let's turn our attention to the West African nation of Niger. A different type of storm has hit this country, one that could turn it into a battlefield between Russia and the West. I'll explain why in a moment, but first a quick primer. Meet the president of Niger. His name is Mohamed Bazoum. Last week, his presidential guard put him under arrest. Then the military declared they are in charge. Basically, it was a coup. The fourth since the country's independence some 6 decades ago. We covered this last week. But over the past few days, there have been new developments. Other countries have entered the picture. West African nations have issued an ultimatum. They say the president, Bazoum, should be reinstated in 15 days, else they will intervene militarily. The country of Chad is a neighbor of Niger. Their president is visiting. He's talking to the military leaders who pulled off the coup. Meanwhile, the French embassy in Niger has also come under attack. Supporters of the coup threw stones at the embassy. They even tried to start a fire outside the compound and burned the French flag outside the building. What explains this protest? Well, Niger was once a French colony. French forces are still deployed in the country. The protesters want them to leave. They blame France for their problems, for the state of insecurity in Niger and for the rampant militancy in West Africa. And amid all of this, something very interesting was observed. Listen, look at this in fact. Supporters of the coup were seen carrying Russian flags. You saw the flags, they're very similar to the French flag, the same colors, but the Russian flag has the color blue in the middle. Now, the coup supporters raised the Russian flags outside the French embassy in Niger, and some were even seen chanting, "Russia and long live Putin."
We are not against young people raising the Russian flag. It's because they've seen how certain countries in the region are cooperating with Russia, thinking that there's equal treatment, and that's why they've brought out these flags.
So is Russia supporting the coup in Niger? Is it in lockstep with the country's military? If not the Kremlin directly, what about the Wagner mercenary group? Are they supporting these generals in Niger? So far, there have been mixed signals. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has issued a statement. He has called for a return to constitutional order in Niger. Earlier today, the Kremlin called for restraint from all sides. Russian President Putin said Russia is against coups. And this was yesterday during Russia's Africa summit, but Putin was quick to conflate the situation in Niger with what was happening in Ukraine.
You said, dear colleagues, that we are against coup d'etat. I am in full agreement. We too are against coups d'etat. But the other problem that led to today's crisis is the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. That specifically was an unconstitutional, armed and bloody state coup, which the Western countries actively supported.
It almost sounds like a justification, and Moscow's plea for calm may may in fact give time for the military rulers to chalk out their next move. Then there's the Wagner Group. Their chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has supported this coup in Niger. An audio message was released on a social account linked to Wagner. And here Prigozhin called the coup a good thing. He even offered the support of Wagner troops. He said his troops could restore order in the country. Now, it's unclear how closely Wagner forces and Russia are aligned in this. So far, there is no evidence of Wagner troops working in Niger. This is what the US said on Thursday.
To your question about Russia, Putin, I know there's been question about Wagner Group as well. Until now, we have not seen incredible indications of Russian or Wagner involvement.
But Wagner troops are active just across the border in the neighboring country of Mali. It's a country that has seen its own military coup in recent months. And Mali's military junta has also blamed the French for their problems. Last year, they expelled French troops from Mali. They burnt down the French embassy, and they've been working closely with Russia and Wagner ever since. Then we come to another neighbor of Niger, a country called Burkina Faso. It saw the exact same scenario play out, a military coup where France was blamed and the generals aligned with Russia. Niger seems to be going down the same road.
We want them to link cooperation ties with Mali and Burkina, with whom we share the common enemy, to combat the terrorism raging in the Sahel.
Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. 3 countries, one story. Elected governments ousted on the same pretext, their failure to deal with militancy. The region is also known as the Sahel. It is home to many extremist groups. The ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, they've all been operating here for years. The Sahel region has seen 7 coups in the last 3 years. And with every coup, the country shifts towards Moscow and away from the West. The West in general, and France in particular, become the enemy. Now again, there's nothing suggesting Russia's involvement in the Niger coup yet. But there's no doubt that Moscow benefits from what's happening. It keeps getting new authoritarian allies in West Africa, and this makes the region a new arena for Putin to fight the West. And now let's turn our attention to the US. An unusually hot summer is sweeping the nation. Americans are finding ways to beat the heat. Many of them are venturing to freshwater bodies. Sounds like a summer dream, but for some people, it is turning out to be quite the opposite. They've contracted brain-eating amoeba. That's right, amoeba that devours the brain. And they died from it. It's a rare but deadly infection. If someone catches it, there's a 97% chance of death. Thousands of such cases have been seen across the world. So how can you recognize this infection and how can you avoid it? Our next report tells you.
This is an amoeba. You know, the fascinating shapeshifter. Many of us drew it with precision back in school biology lessons, though not much precision was required, because this is a unicellular organism with the ability to alter shape. Science being science doesn't leave it at that though. It has analyzed different kinds of amoeba and declared several types. One of them is called Naegleria fowleri. It's a famous one. The name sounds slightly complicated, which is probably why it has a nickname, and an apt one. This is called brain-eating amoeba, and it's just as deadly as it sounds. Recently, the amoeba claimed its latest victim, a man in the US state of Georgia. The amoeba destroyed his brain tissue, and he died from it, much like the 2-year-old boy from Nevada who died from the infection earlier this month. But before we talk about the latest cases, let's start with the basics. How does this amoeba spread its disease? It infects the body and causes damage to the brain, hence the name. It lives in soil and freshwater lakes, rivers, ponds, and hot springs, basically warm environments. It's not found in saltwater like in oceans, or properly treated swimming pools. It enters the body while someone is in the freshwater, like when they're swimming, submerging, or even splashing. The water enters the body through the nose, so does the amoeba, and then it travels to the brain. What do the symptoms look like? They usually come on strong, and they progress rapidly, within 5 days of contracting the disease. They include headache, fever, nausea, and vomiting. Later, the situation worsens and symptoms increase. They progress to stiff neck, confusion, seizures, hallucinations, and coma. And all of this usually leads to death. The infection kills about 97% of the people it infects. It's often a losing battle. There is no consensus on effective treatment against it. Brain-eating amoeba may be fatal and hard to detect. But it is also rare to contract this infection. According to the WHO, anywhere between 1 to 2,000 cases have occurred globally. They are mainly seen in Australia, Europe, and the US. In the past 5 years, the US has seen 3 cases each year, and cases have been on the rise worldwide. Now, while this amoeba is a cold-blooded murderer, it likes warmth. Because of climate change, our world is heating up, so more places are warmly welcoming this amoeba. For instance, most infections in the US happened during the summer, and they happened in the south. But in the past few years, they have been moving upwards. Infections are cropping up farther north during bouts of extreme heat. Only last year, this amoeba was identified in South Korea for the first time. In India, the first case was detected in 2016 in the state of Kerala. Following this, there have been a few cases in the country, mainly in the southern states. The most recent one also came from Kerala this month. So, more countries are seeing cases of this infection. It's as rare as it's deadly. Since 1962, only 4 people have survived it. So, how can you avoid it? Experts say assume it's present in every freshwater body, so avoid jumping in. But if you can't, try keeping your head above the water, because it could save you, both literally and metaphorically.
There was a big cricket final yesterday. Some 370 runs were scored. One of the captains also hit a century. But chances are you did not hear about it. Do you know why? Because this match did not happen in Mumbai or Karachi or Melbourne. It happened in Dallas, in the United States of America. Now I know what you're thinking. Do people even watch cricket in the US? Well, most of them don't. And that's what this new cricket league is hoping to change. It is called MLC, or Major League Cricket. The first season has just been completed. 6 teams were involved this time. Some of their names will ring a bell, like Los Angeles Knight Riders or Mumbai Indians New York or Texas Super Kings. These teams are owned by Indian Premier League clubs. They're basically IPL subsidiaries. MI New York won yesterday's match. They were crowned the inaugural champions. But how was the local response? Well, it's a bit complicated. Don't think of the MLC like you think of the IPL. The IPL is worth around $15 billion. The MLC has only invested around 180 million. So let's not even compare the two. The infrastructure is also not up to the mark. Most of the matches were played in baseball stadiums. They had to be converted to play cricket. Nonetheless, the local participation was good. Most matches were sold out. A majority of the crowd was made up of South Asians. The league has big plans, in fact, in the coming years. All 6 teams have committed to building home stadiums. They also have some savvy investors. The team from Seattle, for instance, is co-owned by Satya Nadella. He's the CEO of Microsoft. The team from Texas is co-owned by Ross Perot Jr. He's a prominent businessman, also the son of a former presidential candidate. The big highlight is the South Asian participation, mostly Indian Americans. As a business decision, it makes perfect sense. Indian Americans have the money, they have the political clout, they also have the interest. So if you want to grow cricket in the US, you can't do it without Indian Americans. But that alone is not going to be enough. Let me show you some numbers. Cricket has around 4 million fans in the United States. Cycling has almost double that. Basketball has 48 million. Baseball, 53 million. So cricket has a long way to go. And don't think this is just a private sector project. The ICC, or the International Cricket Council, is also on the job. They have awarded next year's T20 World Cup to the US and West Indies. 4 American cities will host matches. They're also looking to include cricket in the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. So there is a big roadmap already in place. But what explains the sudden interest in the US? Why does cricket want to crack America? For starters, there is big money. Let me show you a comparison. During the IPL playoffs, advertisements in fact cost around $90,000. That's $90,000 for a 30-second video. Guess how much the Super Bowl charges? $7 million. The North American market is massive. The ad money, the streaming money, the ticket costs, all of this is much higher than anywhere in the world. And that's one reason. The second reason is this. Cricket needs an expansion plan. It is the second most watched sport on the planet. Around 2.5 billion people watch cricket. But most of them are from one region, the Indian subcontinent. You take that out and cricket loses all the money and relevance. Consider this. The next FIFA World Cup will have 48 teams. But the next Cricket World Cup will have only 10. It remains a game limited to Britain's former colonies. The goal is to break away from that, to get more and more countries to play cricket. And I know all of this sounds exciting, especially if you're watching us from India, but this is all easier said than done. Cricket is a grassroots game. You need to have proper systems right down to the local district. Only then can you field a good national team. Can the US build such a system? More importantly, do they want to build such a system? You can't bank only on South Asian support to build cricket in America. You need non-immigrants to get hooked. And how do you do that? Easy, by building a good team. Indians are hooked on cricket because our teams do well. Same with Australia or England or South Africa. No one wants to see their country lose, and knowing the Americans more so. If the US can field a good side, maybe win some matches, then things will change. Which is why the MLC is so important. It can give American cricketers more exposure, it can create the best infrastructure, and of course, the money helps. If cricket can establish itself in the US, it could set the stage for further expansion. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story, starting with a visual treat for all the adventure junkies out there. In fact, an athlete walked the world's longest single building slackline in Qatar. The slackline was at a height of over 185 meters. It was only about 2 centimeters wide. A word of caution, please do not try something like this on your own. In the United States, a fisherman celebrating his birthday got to see a sight so rare that even marine scientists are in awe. He saw 3 humpback whales jumping in perfect synchronization. The man called it a once-in-a-lifetime experience. In California, a man walked into his backyard only to find a bear making the most of his jacuzzi. Temperatures are rising and everyone has simple bare necessities. Excuse the Jungle Book pun. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1971, Apollo 15 became the first mission to use the lunar roving vehicle. Previous teams of astronauts were restricted to short walking distance around the landing site, and this was because of bulky space suits. But lunar roving vehicles changed the game. They offered greater surface mobility. Fun fact, it took only 17 months to develop this technology. Experts say many scientific discoveries made in the consecutive Apollo missions would not have been possible without these lunar roving vehicles. And a quick update before we go. If you miss our live show at 9 p.m. IST, do not worry. You can now catch a repeat at 7:30 a.m. on weekdays. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Copy. We're at all of the tenants now.
I'm bringing
transmitted copy.